Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another video with Swagglehawks. Action Comics #1. The best comic book in the entire comic book collecting hobby. The creme de la creme. A perfect score on the swag scale for this book right here. 26 out of 25. And this copy right here is the crown jewel of my collection. Never going to leave it. Never going to leave my hands. Which apparently is not the same for some holders of Action Comics #1. Specifically that of holders or owners of the Action Comics #1 Rocket copy. Because in this video, we need to talk about how there are so many paper-handed individuals out there in the comic book market selling their grail comic books. And so we have to talk about this record sale here in 2023. Already, the Swagglehawks predictions for 2023 are seemingly busted because I went on record as to say that I didn't think that we were going to see as many record prices, yet I stand corrected. Here we are today with a $3.5 million sale for that particular copy. But are we really so sure that these numbers are as honest as the headlines purport them to be? Well, in this video, we're going to talk about that. We're going to kind of dig into this Rocket copy, and then we might take a little trip to my favorite place, Pepe Sylvia Town. But before I get into the video, if you guys could drop me a like or a comment or subscribe if you're enjoying the content, helps support the channel, doing those things I would appreciate. But let us get into this video here today. Now, we have to talk about this headline news. Recently this week, we had the sale for the Action Comics #1 in a 6.0 grade, the Rocket copy. And I will pull up the article with you guys here. This is a CGC article. And let's go through it together and talk a little bit about this copy, a book that we have talked about on this channel before. And just to point it out, in the last calendar year, this copy has been sold 3 times. Now, let's put that into perspective, okay? Action Comics #1 as a comic typically only sells 3 times a year. I mean, on average, right? And for this particular copy to exchange hands this many times, well, I don't know. It feels a little bit strange to me. And I'll leave it at that. But let's go through the article here. CGC graded Action Comics #1 sells for a record $3.55 million. That $3.55 million makes it the 3rd most expensive comic to ever be sold. Very, very nearly behind the Amazing Fantasy 15 that sold in the 9.6 grade and a Superman #1 that sold at $5 million in a private sale. But let's kind of go through this article here. Of course, you guys remember this copy famously has the rocket ship right here stamped by whoever the original owner was, you know, way back in the day. But let's read this through here. The first $1 million comic book sale of 2023 has arrived. The famous Rocket copy of Superman's first appearance in Action Comics #1, which is graded by CGC, set a new record when it was sold for $3.55 million in a private deal brokered through Comic Connect on January 24th, 2023. Let's kind of flash forward. That's just the history of the book. The book has traded hands 3 times in just over a year, increasing in value each time. It also sold for $3.18 million in a heritage auction sale in January of 2022, then for $3.4 million in a deal brokered by Golden Auctions and Metropolis Comics of New York in September of 2022. In a news release issued by Comic Connect, the buyer, choosing to remain anonymous, said, "As a kid, I've always dreamed of getting an Action Comics #1 someday, and I'm so excited to get one in a great grade." The article then goes on to talk about the Superman book and AF-15, and then finishes with only 25 days into the year. This is the first $1 million comic sale of 2023. There were 9 CGC graded comics that sold for more than $1 million each in 2022 and 8 in 2021. So there you see it right there. The 6.0 Action Comics #1, the Rocket copy, once again trades hands to some other collector, and each time it has done so in this last calendar year has gone up in value. And this is the thing that I think is kind of interesting about this particular sale or these, particular sales that have gone back to back. Now, I don't fancy myself a conspiracy theorist by any stretch of the imagination, but I feel like it's important for us to take a little trip down into Pepe Sylvia town with this one, because I do find it curious that a book like this, like I already mentioned, that typically only sells about 3 times a year, that this particular copy has changed hand 3 times. Well, let's kind of dig into a little bit of the history of this one. And I want to go to a couple other articles and press releases for this book, because what I find so interesting about it is that it is really difficult every single time around to figure out who the actual buyer of these books are. Now, I guess that is sort of the hobby of comic book collecting. I'm not necessarily inferring that we should know who the buyer is, but wouldn't you think of the 3 sales that have happened, wouldn't there be a picture of like one of the buyers, like, you know, smiling with the copy and people shaking hands and, you know, having one of those press pictures? I mean, typically that is something that happens in these deals. But, you know, before I go any further, let's kind of dig into this article that was September 15th of 2022. This was talking about the second sale for this particular book. So the headline reads, Rocket copy of Action Comics #1 sells for $3.4 million. A copy of Action Comics #1 that sold at auction for $3.18 million on Heritage in January has been sold again in a private sale for $3.4 million, according to the collectible marketplace Golden, which of course, if you guys know, Golden Auctions is another sort of auction house that do a lot of these deals, which arranged the private sale in conjunction with Metropolis Comics of New York. Now, if you guys know, Metropolis Comics is owned by Vince Zerzulo, who, you know, I've talked to him on the channel multiple times before. He's been in some of the videos where I talk to the dealers. I've done interviews with him, and, you know, he's a good guy, and we've had good conversations from time to time, but he is the owner of Metropolis Comics, which is also has some connection to Comic Connect. I'm not actually sure how, you know, those two companies differentiate, if they do, or what the specific breakdown is there. I feel like Comic Connect is maybe a separate business. Maybe Metropolis Comics is his actual comic dealing business, and Comic Connect is an auction house that is separated from that. But again, in conjunction with Metropolis Comics, Golden kind of brokered this deal. This is the highest price paid for the Action Comics #1 copy, which contains the first appearance of Superman, blah, blah, blah. The only other thing I want to point out right here is when they talk about the original sale for the Heritage, the comic stayed with the family of the original purchaser until it was sold at auction in January. So, you know, if we think about what we know about this copy so far, if, you know, we want to go into conspiracy town. So apparently, you know, this was a original owner copy. Someone bought it off the rack all the way back then. They're the ones that put the rocket ship on it. It stayed with that family. And then in January, it legitimately went up for sale to Heritage auctions, and that one sold for $3.18 million. Now, I want to go over to this other press release article right here that came out in January 23. This is talking about the current sale for this book. But I thought the wording here was kind of interesting when we go to what it was talking about with one of the previous sales, where it says, in January of 2022, the Action Comics #1 Rocket copy sold for $3.18 million at Heritage at public auction. Then in September of 2022, a collectibles company sold the same book for $3.4 million. So I don't know if this is just one of those like kind of mincing of words or I'm looking too far into it, but it says a collectibles company sold it for $3.4 million. We know that this article right here in this press release talked about how it was brokered between Golden Auctions and Metropolis Comics. And so are they insinuating with that being the collectibles company then brokered this deal for the $3.4 million one? Are we saying that the collectibles company was the one that acquired the Heritage auction book? Now, again, not trying to be a conspiracy theorist here, but if I was going to write a script and I was trying to think of the most kind of interesting story that I could tell with this particular copy, is I do sort of suspect if, you know, the first sale that we got for this book, the $3.18 million one off of Heritage, was actually bought by Golden Auctions itself, or at least, you know, some company in affiliation with Golden Auctions where they actually picked up that book. And then Golden Auctions, or some collectible company, brokered a deal to Metropolis Comics and Comic Connect, who now, you know, effectively sold this to presumably someone who actually wants to hold the book. And, you know, if that's actually the case where this book is just going from one dealer to the next dealer to the next dealer to finally a collector, maybe there's nothing wrong with that. But I do think it is interesting to see how, you know, each time this book has sold, there's been sort of a PR event around it, right? And if we're kind of inferring that like, oh, Action Comics #1 sets a new record price, But really, behind closed doors, this record price is basically being bought up by other, big pocketed dealers out there or big pocketed, auction houses, then is it really a sale that should be generating this kind of hype for comic books? I mean, I guess this is kind of where I want to maybe, finish the video and talking about some of these record sales and things like that. And maybe just talk about the whole comic book back issue industry and the collectible world as a whole. One of the things that we have to remember is that everybody wants this, right? Everybody who collects comic books wants the big sexy headline. Oh, this comic book sets a record price. Because anybody who collects comic books, who deals in comic books, who invests in comic books or sells comic books or whatever, has a lot to gain from the industry doing well. I mean, the headline of, oh, collectibles as, alternative investments, and like, oh, collectibles are recession proof. They never go down in value. Look at this. This book in 1 year in this economy is still able to set this fantastic price. It's beating out every single other, investable asset out there in the market. We all want this to, be a success. I mean, there is a whole ecosystem built around this. I mean, even my channel right here. I mean, if comic book headlines are out there talking about record prices, then people read those headlines, they see that, they start to think, oh, maybe I should buy some comic books. And then they start to go to YouTube and they find YouTube channels like mine. They say, hey, here's this guy Swagglehos talking about comic books. And then, this whole ecosystem is created. And while I do realize that this is a thing that in some ways indirectly benefits someone like me, I also do think that if in fact it is dealers sort of selling to dealers and kind of creating this PR machine so that they can eventually find, the right buyer, because maybe at the time in which the Action Comics copy was going to sell on Heritage, Golden, who was looking at it, was thinking to themselves like, oh, this book is not going to sell for as much as it should. I think I can make more money on it at a later date. In fact, I think that we should make a play and buy this book so that then we can find the private seller, because as we all know, guys, like auctions themselves aren't going to be able to yield the same price as sort of a buy it now, right? If you can broker a private sale deal, you're going to be able to get a higher premium, a higher price, because you can wait, you can find the right buyer, as opposed to have it, sell in a very small auction window where someone has to be ready at that particular moment, at that particular time. And I feel like, some of the kind of back dealings and things like that ultimately can hurt some collectors, some people out there in the hobby. I think if people think of comic books as like the be all end all, this is the place to invest your money, look at it, they never go down in value. I think that there's going to be a lot of people who get burnt, because while I don't think that Action Comics -- isn't a book that is going to be able to sort of weather, recessions and be an investable comic book, historically speaking, from here on out for the next couple hundred years, I do think that there are a lot of comic books that get, grouped into that sort of stuff, and people get mistaken in what comic books to buy or invest in because they think all comic books have value. That's why you get a lot of these people who, go to the LCS and they sell, their comic book collection because they see these headlines and they think to themselves like, oh, I have a bunch of old vintage comic books. These must be worth money. People are mistaken in that way. And people might get burned in some ways, or they might be trying to make a lot of money by buying into comic books when really at the end of the day, the people who probably make the most money are the ones selling the picks and shovels, if you know what I mean. So this is what I think is really interesting. Again, I have no idea if this was a real auction. Perhaps I'm making much ado about nothing. It is interesting to see that a copy like this, of this caliber of book, this particular copy has exchanged hands 3 times in less than a year. I definitely think there's some interesting things behind the scenes going on with that one. But again, maybe I am totally out of bounds with this. Maybe I have my tinfoil hat on too tight and I am speaking out of turn. Anyways, that's all for this video. Let me know what you guys think. What did you guys think about this private sale? $3.55 million for an Action Comics #1. This book selling multiple times in a calendar year. What do you guys think about that? What do you guys think happened here? I mean, perhaps, at the end of the day, maybe it is, reasonable to expect that Metropolis Comics or Golden Auctions is always going to be associated with these sales. Like, even if they themselves aren't the buyers, maybe it is that, how many, dealers are there that can consign this type of stuff? If you're, operating in the space with a lot of money, maybe these are the only 2 or 3 people that you can actually work with. So if you're somebody who, let's say you bought it from Heritage Auction for $3.18 million, and then you were like, actually, I kind of want to sell my comic book, so let me hit up the Golden Auction guy to help me sell it. And then, then when they sell it to somebody else who buys it, that person was like, oh, I want to sell it again. Let me just work with the same, agent who I just worked with to sell it once again because I want to get out of this particular book, which again calls into question, if that is the case, that you have 3 different collectors who in this particular copy of this particular book were already willing to sell their position on it. I mean, that sort of does kind of put a little bit of a stain on comic books. I mean, what does that say about, these people who are high-end investors? Do they actually feel like maybe comic books aren't as safe an investment as we go into 2023? Maybe they were somebody who was like, you know what, I want to dust my hands of this thing. I actually don't want to hold on this copy. And that would be kind of damning in its own right if you found out that big-pocketed collectors and big-pocketed investors actually want to get rid of these high-end comic books. I mean, because if you think about, even though it is sold, each time for a little bit more money, I mean, there's not much profit going on in this particular scenario, right? Like even if it's sold for, a few $100,000 more each time around, I mean, you have all the fees associated with that. I mean, Metropolis and Golden, they're going to make their commissions on it. They probably made, 10%, anywhere from, I'd say, 3 to 10%. Maybe they're pocketing $200,000 on each sale. Maybe that's worth it to them. That's why they picked up the book and then sold it to the next person and then sold it to the next person because, whatever it sells for, they're still going to make, that $200,000 commission, which is a pretty sweet payday, if you ask me. Anyways, that's all right for this video. Let me know what you guys think. What do you guys think about this news story? Drop me a like, comment, subscribe if you're enjoying the content, and I'll see you in the next one.